Alrighty, today we're going to be talking about front squats and going through a number of different front squat progressions, regressions, how to work around some of the limitations maybe in your front squat. And the front squat is quite a challenging movement. It requires good ankle flexibility. It requires strong and flexible knees. It requires strong and flexible hips. There's a lot of pressure placed on our midline, so we need to know how to brace our midline. And then there's the added demands of like the upper body flexibility. So we're talking shoulder flexibility, we're talking wrist flexibility, and being able to get that nice, strong front rack position. And we're going to cover as much of that as we can in this video. So let's get stuck in. One quick thing I want to say is in some of my demonstrations in this video, you'll see me inside the squat rack, unracking the bar and coming forward and demonstrating the squats. That's purely so you can see what I'm doing in terms of my squat. I wouldn't recommend that that's how you unrack the bar for your front squats. We want to be facing into the rack when we do our front squats. When we're fresh, when we're first coming to start the set, it's easy to unrack the bar, walk backwards, set our feet, and then start to do our front squats. At the end of the set, that's when we're going to be the most fatigued. Now, it's much easier to walk the bar forward and put it back in the rack than it is to walk the bar backwards and try and find the rack when we've come to the end of the set. So I recommend always unracking the bar from this way, facing into the rack, walking back, and then finishing your set by walking forward. Okay, so the first thing we want to talk about is gripping the bar. Now, some people don't have the flexibility in their shoulders, in their upper body to be able to hold the correct front rack. So we're going to talk about progressions or variations that we can use for that front rack position if you've got limited flexibility. But first off, I want to talk about a common issue we see is people grip the bar far too narrow, and then they're trying to unrack the bar here, and then they're in this uncomfortable position. It's not comfortable on the wrists, and they're really sort of just very confined in that upper body. So what we want to do is we want to take a wider grip. So when I'm setting up for this, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to place the bar against my throat. So it's above the collarbone in this position. This brings the bar nice and close to the body. It's actually going to create a much more secure rack position. My hands are going to be outside of my shoulders. Okay, so when I grip the bar, it's outside shoulders. This allows me to drive the elbows forward, and it creates this sort of W shape where the forearm is at an angle. The wrist is outside the elbow, and the elbow is outside the shoulder. So here's one side of the W, and then obviously this would be the other side of the W shape in this position. So this allows me to get good shoulder external rotation and allows me to unrack the bar with the bar sitting on the anterior delts of the shoulder. The weight isn't sitting on my wrist and my hands in that position if I have the flexibility. In fact, this is one way we can do a front squat. I can hold my arms up here and it feels like the bar is choking me. The bar's resting on the shoulders and throat. And I can do my front squat in that position. And that's how close we want the bar. We want to feel that that bar is nearly choking us as we're doing those squats. And the hands are there obviously just to support the bar and to help keep the bar balanced, especially when we're adding the weight. We can physically push the bar back into the throat, keeping the elbows up, allowing us to do a nice deep front squat with a strong rack position. So that's if you've got the flexibility. If you've got the flexibility to be able to do that and keep the bar resting on the shoulders, then you're in a good position with your front rack. If not, chances are you've got tight triceps and lats, and you need to work on improving your shoulder flexion, all right? Now, this could come through exercises like butcher's block. This could also mean that you've got sort of tight pecs or lats, and you'll need to work on pec stretches and lat stretches. The bicep also comes into this. So there's a lot to work on if you've got that limited shoulder flexion range of motion. That doesn't mean you can't front squat. A lot of variations we can work on there. So again, if I was to come in and place the bar here, so it's pushing above the collarbone, and I can bring the arms out in this position. So I've just shown you that we can do a front squat like this. The other thing we can do is we can cross the hands in this position. So if you've got limited flexibility, you can place the hands here and still do your front squat. So that's another variation. One more variation that you can do is to use lifting straps. I actually don't have a pair with me at the moment, but you can tie the lifting straps, the straps you let's say use for your deadlifts, around the bar. So I've got the straps tied around the bar. And then I place them outside my shoulders and I can grab hold of the straps and then I can do a position like this where I'm holding onto the straps as I do my front squats. And this again works for people who have got limited flexibility in their upper body, and it's a way that we can still be able to stabilize the bar and control the bar as we do our front squats. There's one more variation I'm going to talk about later in the front squats demonstration, and it's going to be using the barbell, and we're going to be doing like a pendulum sort of squat. So we're holding on to the barbell and doing our front squats in that position with the bar sort of jammed in the corner of the squat rack. That's just a different variation. So if you struggle with all of these variations of the front rack, maybe that's going to be the one that you're going to choose. Anyway, now let's get stuck into the front squats and talk about some other progressions that we can use if there are limitations in your front squat. Okay, let's start from the ground up and talk about the feet placement. Now, with the front squat, we can stand with the feet just outside hip width, the toes pointing forward. We might want to turn the toes out 10 to 15 degrees, maybe even a little bit more if that works for you. Or you might want to take the feet to be sort of shoulder width apart. Feet straight, feet slightly turned out. It's up to you. You need to find a comfortable squatting stance that works for you, all right? So experiment with this. There are times where we might do a narrow stance front squat. There are times where we might do a wide stance front squat. There are different variations that will target the muscle slightly differently, and none of them are incorrect as long as you've got the ability to be able to perform those front squats with good technique in that foot position. One thing I do want to say when we're doing our front squats is we want those knees to be tracking in line with the toes as we go up and down in our squat. We don't want to see those knees collapsing inwards, okay? So when you're working on trying to figure out the width of your stance maybe in your front squat, you want to be able to think about, okay, can I squat with those knees correctly tracking in line with my toes as I go up and down? The wider the stance is when you go here, then the harder that might be for some people. They might feel that they're collapsing there. So again, maybe a narrower stance could be helpful. And then we're going to start to talk about, well, what if you've got limited range of motion in your ankles and you can't squat deep, so it's affecting that. So we're going to think about elevating the heels. So depending on your flexibility, you might be able to just use a small elevation. Maybe some Olympic weightlifting shoes is going to be enough for you. But if you've got very limited ankle flexibility, you might have to start to use a little bit of a higher elevation. So again, you can set your feet up. So balls of the feet are on the ground, heels are on the elevation, and we can be doing a front squat in this position, okay? As flexibility improves in the ankles, we obviously want to start to work down to having the feet flat. So you need to be thinking about accessory exercises that's going to help to stretch out those tight calves and improve your front squat. Okay, so another time where you might consider elevating your heels is maybe when you're front squatting, you have trouble keeping that torso upright and you're sort of starting to dump forward in this position. Now, this can be a sign that the quads are weak. It could also be a sign that you're still lacking that ankle flexibility and you're trying to go deeper. But by elevating the heels, you're going to be finding that it's easier to keep the torso more upright as you start to work through your front squats. Now, when we elevate the heels, we're going to target more of the quads anyway. So if you've got weaker quads and you need to strengthen them, elevating the heels is going to help. Again, if it's due to a lack of ankle flexibility, then you really need to be doing the accessory work that's going to help improve your ankle flexibility so that you can improve your front squat. Okay, so we've talked about the feet placement, we've talked about the ankle flexibility, we've talked about the knees and keeping the knees sort of tracking in line with the toes as we squat. The next thing I want to talk about is the hips. So when we set up to squat and when we start to squat, the further we go down in our range of motion here, the more the hip is moving into internal rotation. So the hips are internally rotating here. Now, if you've got tight hips, or if you start to feel a pinching pain deep inside the hips when you're squatting, chances are you're missing hip internal rotation. And we've got to think about how the upper leg bone needs to be able to rotate in the capsule, inside the hip capsule. So if you're lacking depth due to tight hips, or you're feeling that pinching pain, you might need to work on strengthening the hip internal rotators. So there's a number of different exercises on this channel that you can watch to increase your hip internal rotation strength. Now, at the same time, if I'm squatting down and the hip is moving into internal rotation, then we need length in the external rotators. As the internal rotators shorten, the external rotators must lengthen. So this is the piriformis, this is the glutes, these are the muscles back here. So if these muscles are tight, that can limit your hip internal rotation, and that can cause the pinching pain or the limited range of motion in your hips. So it's good to think about stretching the piriformis and the glutes. Things like pigeon stretch are a great idea. And at the same time, strengthening the hip internal rotators. So this could be potentially a good warm-up set before you go into your hip hinging movements, your squats, your deadlifts as well, into that deep hip flexion, just so it starts to take away some of the pain or discomfort you might feel, or so it starts to improve that range of motion that we're talking about. Okay, we're tracking well here. The next thing we're going to talk about is obviously midline. Above the hips, we move into creating midline tension or intra-abdominal pressure that's going to help us with our front squat. So the breath here is what's going to help us. When we set up for the front squat, we want to be trying to breathe in through the nose, not in through the mouth. Typically when we take a mouth breath, we breathe into the chest, and that's not what we're after here. When we take a nasal breath and we think diaphragmic breath, we're trying to breathe in and expand the stomach. So we're pushing out, but not just forward. We're also trying to push into the sides, and we're even trying to push into the back. So it's like a 360 degrees expansion. If you were wearing a lifting belt, you're trying to push the stomach into that lifting belt and expand all the way around there. I like to use the analogy of a tree here. If you've got a tree with a small base of support, so a small trunk, it's a lot easier to push that tree over. If you've got a tree with a nice broad base, then that tree is a lot more stable, a lot stronger, and a lot harder to push over. So you want to be the tree with the broad base. So we're taking that nice big deep breath in, and then we're holding our breath as we squat down, okay? So we're maintaining that midline pressure. Once we get to the bottom of the squat and we change direction, so holding breath, holding breath, holding breath, get to the bottom, start coming up. Do we exhale through the mouth as if you're blowing up a balloon? So it's a nice constant exhale. That means when you get to the top, you've exhaled and you're ready to take your next breath and do your next repetition. When we're standing up straight, the weight is on the skeletal system. All of the joints are locked. I can take a breath here. It's an easy spot. But as soon as I start to break at the knees and the hips and we start to flex, now the weight is on the muscular system, and that's where we want the tension in the midline to help us. And now the deeper you go, okay, the more pressure is going to build there, because the bottom of the squat is one of those uncomfortable positions where everything's sort of flexed and we're in a deep squatting position. And then as we stand up and we start to change directions, we're moving back to that skeletal system, or we're getting closer to locking out, and we can start to exhale as we come up in the squat. Now, depending on the weight of the squat, if it's going to be a real heavy squat, yes, you're going to have to get really tight before you start the squat and hold your breath. If it's something that's a lighter front squat, you don't have to have 100% tension. You don't need to brace yourself 100%. And this might allow you to do squats where you're going to inhale on the way down. So I could be here going, So I'm building the pressure as I go down, and then I'm exhaling as I come back up. It's just a way to be able to cycle through the squats a little bit faster if they're not working to that max weight. And like I said, you don't need as much intra-abdominal pressure or tension or whatever you want to call it if you're working a lighter weight and you're doing a higher volume of repetitions. So use the breath depending on the percentages and the weights that you're using with your front squat. Now, if you watched my back squats progressions video, you would have seen me use an elevated surface and do box squats as a way of limiting the range of motion in the back squat. So if you had a hip impingement or you couldn't squat deep, we could use the elevated surface and gradually progress, deeper in the squat if we needed to. I don't like to do that with the front squat because the front squat is a little bit more of a dangerous movement in terms of dropping that barbell forward, especially when we're in the squat position. So if we were going to sit and touch our butt to a bench, there's a chance that that could rock the barbell forward and we're going to bail out of that, or we're going to put a lot of pressure potentially on the lower back there. So I don't like to use an elevated surface or a target when I'm doing front squats. I prefer you to stick to your back squat, work on getting a deep back squat and maybe using the box squat there to progress your back squat. And as your back squat improves and the depth of your back squat improves, that's going to carry over to your front squat. So I'd save the front squat for later down the track where you've actually got the mobility. Now, in saying that, this is another progression I often like to use with clients who might struggle with their front squat. And you could say it's like a pendulum squat, or it's also like a landmine squat. So if you've got a landmine in your gym, you can set the barbell in the landmine. If not, you can just put the barbell into the corner of your squat rack and obviously make sure your squat rack's not going to move. So with this one, I'm going to bring the weight up, hold it in this position. Now I need to be leaning into the bar here, okay? Because I've got to find the foot placement that when I squat down, I'm going to be able to sit in that nice deep squat position and stand up. If I'm standing too close to the bar, it's going to push me backwards. So I find that position of, okay, this is going to be the spot where I want to squat. Deep breath in, controlling it down, knees tracking over the toes, nice deep squat. Breathing back out. So this is just another way that we can do front squats if we're maybe lacking that upper body front rack flexibility. It's one that we can load quite heavy, but don't be deceived. The pendulum does come with its own challenges. As I sort of get to a higher point, it sort of gets lighter because the angle is changing. And as I come down, there's a point where it's heavier, 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 and it gets quite heavy in the bottom of the squat. We've got to use our breath to stabilize that midline again. And it can be a great way to build that lower body strength without necessarily having to have that upper body flexibility. Obviously, working on that upper body flexibility with your accessory work. Now, another cool thing I like about this pendulum squat is what it does to the ankles. If you watch closely when I'm doing that pendulum squat from a side view, you'll notice that at the top, the ankle is in a lot of dorsiflexion. Okay, so if this is the shin and this is the ankle, we're sort of leaning forward in that position. But as I squat down, because the barbell is like that pendulum and it's pushing me away a little bit more, that angle actually opens up. Okay, so it's less dorsiflexion in the bottom of the squat as we go. So this can be a good way to increase flexibility in the ankles for someone that doesn't yet have the flexibility to do a normal front squat. They're allowed to lean into the bar here. So often we feel like we're going to fall backwards when we don't have that ankle flexibility. But this way we're sort of leaning forward just a little bit. As we squat down, the angle of the ankle actually opens up, and this is giving us that sort of weight in front of us to support us in the bottom of that squat position. And then as I drive up, I'm sort of leaning into it a little bit more, and the ankles or the calves are getting stretched a little bit in the top position. So another little variation to play with, one that I've used successfully with a lot of my own clients who struggle with their front squat, and being able to progress them quite heavy with this and then see carryover to other squatting movements. So give that a try, see how you go. It's even a great accessory exercise. So after your front squats, if you want to do some more, give these pendulum or these landmine squats a go. If you really struggle with the barbell front squat, or maybe the pendulum squat / landmine squat doesn't work for you, you can also use other variations. So we could do something as simple as doing the goblet squat, holding a weight at your chest, squatting all the way down, coming all the way back up again. Now we can load this with quite a heavy dumbbell. If you've got some heavy dumbbells, you can also hold a kettlebell here. A weight plate you can do, but a little bit maybe cumbersome with the size, but the option is there. Another variation is to have 2 dumbbells and be able to hold them up in this position here. And we can still do our front squats in this position. We're resting the dumbbell, or the weight of the dumbbell, on the shoulder here, okay? So it just gives us that little bit of stability. And again, we are driving the elbows up. Another variation is with the kettlebells. You can hold kettlebells in this front rack position, so a kettlebell in each arm, and still be able to do your front squats here. This one does crush the chest a little bit when the kettlebells are heavy, so it can be harder in terms of the breathing, so just be aware of that. Now, foot placement, elevating the heels, you can do all of that with the goblet squat, with the dumbbell squat, with the kettlebell squat. Find the variation that works for you, that allows you to squat nice and deep and work the best range of motion. And then think about the limitations that you have. Is it my ankles? Is it weakness in my knees? Are my hips letting me down? Is it my upper body flexibility that I need to work on? Potentially it could also be, your thoracic spine position. Are you sort of locked in a bit of kyphosis, and do you need to work on loosening up that thoracic spine to improve your front squat? Whatever it is, you need to work with a coach potentially to work on those limitations to be able to improve your form and technique as accessory work to the front squat. And then it's obviously going to carry over and allow you to work towards, the barbell front squat with your feet flat on the floor. Okay, that's pretty much it with my front squat progressions. There's not as many variations here to play with in terms of the back squat. Like I said, we can use that box squat when we're doing our back squats as a progression to help us squat deeper. And I don't like to use that in the front squat. So virtually what we're playing with in the front squat is we're working on elevating the heels and getting good depth in the front squat. We're working on accessory work to mobilize the ankles if you can't squat with your feet flat. And obviously building the quad strength. We're working on the breath, making sure we're stabilizing through the midline. We're building that intra-abdominal pressure before we squat. We're working on our hip internal, external rotation, making sure we've got internal and external rotation, stretching out those tight muscles and strengthening those weak muscles there. We're working on, obviously, the grip, making sure we've got a good grip on the bar. If we don't have the flexibility for the grip, we've got the zombie squat, arms out straight. We've got the hands crossed, or we've potentially got the lifting straps and using the lifting straps to support the bar in that position. If none of that works for you, then we've got the pendulum, or we've got the landmine squat, whatever you want to call it, as a nice variation to go with. And then we also talked a little bit about goblet squats, front rack kettlebell squats, or we've got the dumbbells on shoulder squats. So lots of variations we can play with here. I did sort of allude to it before, but if you're really struggling with your squat, there's probably a lot of single leg work. There's like split squats and hamstring curls and step ups that you should be working on that's going to deliver better progressions than you doing partial rep squats, partial rep front squats, or partial rep back squats. So if you've got the capacity, go for it. But if you haven't, maybe you need to take a step back and work on the unilateral stuff and then progress forward to the bilateral movements. If you have any questions or comments around these front squat progressions, or if you've got some suggestions of your own, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. Until next time, happy front squats.